Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
I'm Talli Rosenbaum. Today we have an interesting episode. We often have spoken about the premarital messages that are given to couples before they get married. And we've spoken a lot about messages that have been given to young women about marriage, about their roles as a wife. We've spoken about marital obligation and sexual obligation. We've spoken about the Surrendered Wife book. And today, what I really wanted to talk about was the experience of young men and what they learn, what they are taught going into a marital relationship from a perspective of Judaism, obviously. And I'd like to also talk about this concept of, quote unquote, being mevater. What does it mean to be mevater?
Can you explain what that means, Talli?
Well, mevater, the word means to kind of give in, to let go, to not really have expectations, in a sense. And this came up for me in a few ways by young men and also not such young men who have kind of been in marriages in which they were counseled by their rabbis and educators that you should do what your wife wants. Your job is to make your wife happy. If your wife is happy, then you'll be happy. And in some cases, this has come out in a way that has been very, I would say, injurious to the men in these relationships because they were really functioning out of a place of believing that their needs in the marriage make no difference and that they shouldn't really even try to get their wives to understand them. So that's one thing. The other thing that I noticed was in certain couples, and we do see this as couples therapists where one partner, and often it's the male partner, not always, and we've talked about this before. I think we just talked about this in our last episode about, will I marry the right person? Sometimes you have a couple come in and the woman might be more of a vocal complainer, have a list of things that she's upset about. And we would call that, more of an anxious attachment. I need this and I need that and I need you to do this and be this. And he will be more kind of shut down, avoidant. We would call that an avoidant attachment where he has kind of adapted a defense mechanism of believing that what he wants doesn't matter. And he needs to be independent about his wants. And he's not going to really interact much in the therapy. He might just say things like, well, I don't really know why we're here. I do the best I can, and I just want her to be happy. So whatever she wants. And there's no real authenticity or engagement, at least in the beginning, in the process. And I'll find out later that, either it comes from this defense mechanism, this belief that, I didn't get my needs met as a young man, and so I've kind of learned to give up on having any needs, or it's actually part of a value system. And the value system, I believe, is part of the beliefs and teachings that are given to young men certainly in the yeshivish communities, to some extent in certain parts of Hasidish communities in a little bit of a nuanced, different way. But that's kind of what I want to discuss today because I know that you've spoken with young men as an educator, as a Chatan instructor. I'd love to have a conversation about this.
I think it's very important. Part of the problem remains that these messages on the surface sound like very positive and empowering messages to women. It's the kind of thing that we would think that, well, if your wife is happy, you'll be happy. On the surface, people say, wow, that sounds almost like a feminist type of message, and what could be wrong with that? The problem is there sometimes are consequences to that kind of messaging that are unintentional but can be injurious, as you put it. I think part of the problem also remains that, and I've mentioned this before, it's my pet peeve, but in yeshivot, sometimes people step out of line and start giving advice in areas where they're simply not equipped to do so. I think this happens not among everybody, of course, but too often where rabbis believe their own PR, so to speak. They start accepting the genius title and start counseling young men in areas where they simply have no knowledge. And they believe they know what they're talking about. It's not done with malice, but it is done with ego. And it's done arrogantly. And therefore, they can be saying things that sound like very nice messages. Hey, happy wife, happy life. And in fact, they might be telling them something which, without realizing it, they're actually hurting their student for the future. That's part of the problem that I see it. I think what we'll do today, Talli, is go through some of the messages that are very commonly said in yeshivot. Some of them, I'm guessing you'll say, are accurate and they're good messages. Some of them you'll probably say are very much not accurate. And I'm sure many of them will be complicated. So I'll throw out to you over the course of this episode various myths that people learn in yeshiva, and you'll comment on each one of them. By the way, our last episode was entitled, Will I Marry the Wrong Person? And we mentioned that we'd like to do another episode entitled, Did I Marry the Wrong Person? Today, obviously, we are not doing that topic. However, we did not forget, we plan on doing Did I Marry the Wrong Person in a future episode. We'll get to today's topic in a moment. First, check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikveh checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts. Rate and review and leave a comment as well. We are also working on additional projects so that Intimate Judaism can expand its reach further. So please tell people about Intimate Judaism and share the podcast so that we can continue to grow our audience and our influence in a positive way in the Jewish world. Okay, Talli, I know that we want to begin, but I can see that you want to comment on what I said before.
Well, what you said before about these messages seem to even be feminist messages in a way. Listen to what your wife wants, just make her happy. This is actually not feminist at all. And I think that as we get into this conversation, we'll understand more about why an attitude such as do whatever she wants to do and keep her happy is actually quite the opposite of feminist.
Oh, I agree. I think it's paternalistic. I meant that it is often seen as feminist, probably by some people who may not really understand the term, but absolutely.
Right. The other thing you said is also very true about rabbis. I think that this actually exemplifies the issue when you provide a strategic way of having a happy marriage that really has nothing to do with curiosity or trying to understand the people involved, but rather follows a specific formula. And the repairs that need to happen with each person individually and not within the relationship. So if a man goes to a Rav and says, I'm having this and this problem, and the Rav gives them advice, they're giving very generic, stereotypical advice based on their belief. And these are beliefs that are often rampant in many of these books and manuals about marriage, that women are overly emotional and sensitive. They need to be that way because their main job is raising children. Men are rational and practical, and they should be the ones to kind of manage their wives' irrationality by taking responsibility for the marriage. And as I'm sure you can guess, that would not land on most women today as feminist to them. That would really land as quite the opposite.
Certainly.
It's infantilizing, actually.
I think in general, any advice, which is blanket advice for everybody, always requires an asterisk saying this changes in every single couple, even if someone's going to say a general rule, which even might be true sometimes. At times, people will realize it's not true in every single marriage. Let's then open up, Talli, with that exact message. One of the messages, which I wrote down, is the following. Women are deeply emotional beings who need love, attention, and reassurance, in contrast to the husband, whose emotions are generally more subdued. In particular, men sometimes don't understand that when their wives get upset over something that they would find not that upsetting, it's because a woman's emotions are felt more acutely than a man's, quite often. That's myth number one, since you mentioned that one. And could you comment on the truth or falsity of that particular idea?
Well, I think that what I would want to comment on is the idea that that they don't necessarily need any emotional validation. And what comes up for me first is this idea of masculinity, what masculinity means. We talk about toxic masculinity, and we wouldn't necessarily believe that these messages perpetuate toxic masculinity. You're telling men to be sensitive to their wives' emotional needs, which is a very positive message. But you are also sending the message that you don't get to have vulnerability as a man. You don't get to have emotional needs. You need to be more resilient. You don't even really understand what it means to feel upset about something. That's the message that's sent here.
Okay. Understood that the message might be incorrect in that sense, but is there truth to this idea that by and large, women do feel their emotions more acutely than men do? Again, generalizations, but is it possibly true?
I don't know. I think we would have to look at the research on that. But I think that these are based so much on socialization and culture. In other words, I think that if we have these beliefs about women being more emotional and men being more practical, then we are going to continue to teach that. And we're going to continue to perpetuate that because women will feel more entitled to be as emotional and irrational as they are allowed to be. And men will feel unentitled to have an emotional world. They will need to suppress that because the message is that it's not masculine. And it starts with very early messages about how boys don't cry. And this is perpetuated by the media and by also in Western culture, not only, but it's also very much a message in fundamental Christian societies. It's kind of a 1950s type of marital message. And I don't think that it really
The surrendered wife,
kind of the surrendered wife. And I think that these ideas that you have to keep your wife happy because she is emotional and immature and doesn't really know how to balance the checkbook and doesn't really know what's going on financially. So you have to tell her and you have to be nice to her. And if she wants to buy something, then you have to let her because she doesn't have her own sense of financial responsibility. These are all very damaging messages, and they don't require and they don't expect for there to be relational ways to resolve things as equal partners.
Over Hanukkah, our family watched at home the Disney Pixar cartoon Inside Out 2.
I took my granddaughter actually to that.
So it was cute and I liked it. And at the end, that message was very, very clear because admittedly it was a joke, it was a comedy. But at the end, when the daughter says something which was bothering the mother, they asked, how was camp? And she says, good. So they show inside the mother's head and the various characters representing her emotions are essentially freaking out. Good, good. That's all we get is a good. And then they go inside the father's head and they say, good. Yeah, checks out, and they start watching the game again and ignore it. And that's basically the message you're saying. It's a comedy, but it is a message that we learn.
Exactly.
Here's another myth, which is taught in yeshivot. The husband must take full responsibility for the state of the marriage. If challenges arise, he is encouraged to introspect and improve himself rather than blame his wife. Thus, by refining his own character, the husband can indirectly influence his wife and bring harmony to the relationship. In different terms, this was once expressed to me about a certain book that talks about Jewish marriage. That book was summarized as a joke by somebody who told me. The book basically comes down to this. I'm sorry. You're right. It won't happen again. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. What do you think of this?
Well, look, first of all, it isn't about either blaming your wife or taking on full responsibility. Okay, option number 3 is let's discuss this in a relational way and let's look at one another as equally capable of understanding each other's feelings, being able to validate and empathize one another. That's not happening here. Giving the message that you shouldn't blame your wife for everything, that's good. You shouldn't. But giving the message that it's up to you to deal with every issue is the ultimate insult to women because there's no expectation of them to be able to hear and listen to understand what's going on for you. It's kind of like I was talking to my friend this morning and she mentioned the soft bigotry of low expectations. George Bush said this, I think it was in 2000. It refers to like very subtle and often unintentional form of discrimination. And it occurs when certain groups, minorities, are held to lower standards because of assumptions about their abilities. And even though this is kind of a conservative concept, I think it's important here because that's kind of what's happening. There is no message here that you and your wife, you and your partner need to do the work together. There's work to be done here. If it's between you and God, then you've triangled God into it and kind of left your wife out of it.
Okay, so given that, I'd like to actually read you a story, Talli, which is a very well-known story. I'm going to read the version that appears in the book by Rabbi Aaron Feldman, who's the Rosh Yeshiva of Ner Yisrael. The book is called The River, the Kettle, and the Bird. I've seen this story written elsewhere, but he writes it nicely because I think this sort of is a good example of what we're talking about. A man had no money to buy an etrog for Sukkot. His wife had an exceptional pair of tefillin, which she had inherited from her father and had given him in her dowry. Since the husband owned another pair of tefillin, he decided to sell those tefillin to buy himself an etrog with the proceeds. At the end of the day, he returned home beaming with joy, with an excellent and expensive etrog in his hands. His wife couldn't believe her eyes. "Where on earth did you get money to buy such a beautiful etrog?" she asked. I sold your father's tefillin. They were not being used anyway. The wife exploded in anger. You fool! You dared sell my father's tefillin? She lunged at her husband and knocked the etrog out of his hands. It fell to the ground, and a piece broke off, making it unfit for use. The man calmly bent over, picked up the etrog, held it in his hand to appraise the damage, but didn't say a word. And then, after a few moments, he suddenly began singing and dancing. His wife looked at him in amazement. Are you out of your mind? She asked. Not at all, he said, obviously very happy. I lost my precious tefillin. I lost my perfect etrog. But I was able to control myself, and I did not lose my shalom bayit, peace in the home. Could anything be more of a reason for joy? I've heard that story said many times as a piece of admiration for the husband. I'd like to hear your take on that story.
Did you want to tell me your take first?
I think it is.
You've got that look. Clearly, the woman here is being portrayed as a child. And the husband is going to lehit alot aleha, like he's going to be able to...
He's rising above the situation.
He's rising above, he's transcending above the situation and being able to control himself.
So I don't like the portrayal of the wife.
That brings shalom bayit. That brings shalom bayit. Well, it does not bring shalom bayit. There's always a cycle, right? The more, the more. So the more the husband is inauthentic and does not have any expectation to bring in his feelings, actually, the more upset she's going to get and the more reactive she's going to get, which gives him a lot of power, by the way. This is really very much a power struggle. He knows that the more he can keep his emotions in and not react and shut down or whatever he does. And by the way, there's an outcome to that too, because these guys are much more untrustworthy in terms of their behaviors, betrayal behaviors and acting out behaviors. That's a whole other issue. For example, let's say a man is coming home from work and he's going to be late, and he understands that he's making his wife unhappy by being late. So he's in a conflict with himself because he's not allowed to make his wife unhappy. And he also hasn't learned that he can have the expectation to call her and say, listen, honey, I'm running late. I'm really sorry. I know you're disappointed, because his expectation is she wouldn't understand him anyway. She's not capable of that. And so what he ends up doing is not calling her. What he ends up doing is just showing up late. When you don't have any kind of ability to be assertive, because assertiveness is going to get your feelings across and also at the same time allow space to give empathy for your partner's feelings, then you have no other choice but to act out in a passive aggressive way. And so coming home late without calling is going to be the passive aggressive kind of acting out that you will end up doing, because you don't really have a lot of other choices. But he also knows that the less reactive he is, and as an avoidant, he's good at being less reactive, the more reactive she becomes, and that gives him power. That gives him power. So it's actually very non-relational, this story.
I mean, let's also not forget in this story that he sold his wife's father's precious tefillin for an etrog that he's going to use. Meaning, there's something about a lack of communication here and a lack of not knowing the boundaries, which really bothers me in terms of that relationship. He's portrayed, at least as I see it. I don't think anyone's talking about, what were you thinking? She's right. Maybe she was wrong to throw his etrog onto the floor. That's not the right reaction, or not an appropriate reaction in that case. But why did he sell this precious family heirloom? And he's the superhero for now. Oh, I'm not going to get mad. And he's like, I lost my tefillin. No, you didn't. You sold the tefillin. I lost my etrog. Yeah. Well, again, the paternalistic, arrogant attitude towards the wife is really bothering me. I don't like it at all.
Right. Listen, because this template does promote entitlement, because it puts him on top. If you're responsible, then you also have a lot of rights. Being in the position of needing for your husband to do whatever you want and listen to you isn't a position of power.
It's the surrendered wife all over again.
It's the mirror image of the surrendered wife. I have to tell you, before we did this episode, I wrote an email to some valued colleagues of mine, and one of them, Dr. Klafter, Nachum Klafter, he said that he feels that this approach is chauvinistic chivalry, is what he called it. And then another one of my colleagues, who I'm not going to name because I didn't ask her permission, called the surrendered wife subservient superiority. So I kind of love this framing where there's nothing really relational here in either subservient superiority or chauvinistic chivalry. It doesn't have any space here for communication, for vulnerability, for repair. And really, what will happen is that there will be resentment. There will be feelings of victimization. A lot of these men are very, very torn because a part of them feels like they would want to talk about it. They would want to be able to share how they feel like it's not fair to them, or they're upset about it, or they want to negotiate it. But the right thing to do in terms of what they're being taught, the values, is that they should just, shut up and put up. And that's not going to be healthy. There's going to be a way in which he's going to act out that resentment. And it's not going to land in a positive way because it's either going to be some sort of acting out, passive aggressiveness. There's going to be a lot of I see a lot of passive aggressiveness in this type of marital dynamic.
So let's redo that, Talli. Let's say, for example, the story happens. The husband sells his tefillin. He buys an etrog. He brings it home. The wife freaks out and throws the etrog on the floor, and it's puzzle. The husband picks it up and looks at the etrog. But instead of dancing with joy, let's redo this. They might have both made big mistakes in the whole process of getting to here, but that happened already. Now they've come to the point where they don't have the tefillin, they don't have the etrog. What should the husband do at this point? I think singing and dancing was probably not the smartest move, but what would you say if the husband said, Talli, what should I do in this case?
Maybe singing and dancing at that moment might have been not a terrible move because it allowed him to self-regulate rather than be reactive back. So if his purpose was to deregulate or de-escalate what was going on, that might not be a bad thing. Somebody should be in a position of de-escalating, but the argument's not over. You want to go back after you're able to kind of calm yourself. And she was reactive. And by the way, she has accountability for being reactive. It's understandable, but she can come back later and say, look, I was very reactive. And I did not mean to throw your etrog on the floor. I was out of control. But at the same time, I was really shocked and hurt that without communicating with me, you would take my father's tefillin and sell it. And that made me feel not worthy of even talking about it with. Then he would be able to say, wow, I realized that I did something here without your knowledge and that it made you feel, I guess, like it doesn't matter. I could do what I want. And that wasn't okay. And I also, I feel bad that you threw my etrog and it's puzzle now. And now we really don't have money. Now we don't have to fill in. We don't have an etrog. We've got to be able to repair this.
I'm actually surprised you said that because I would have thought that the singing and dancing is almost sticking his finger in her eye. Perhaps unintentionally.
Well, I think it depends on the intent. In other words, if the intent really was to be passive aggressive or to kind of figure out a way to push his resentment down. I talk a lot about the container and I ask people to say, like, where's your rage? Are you at 50%? Are you at 80%? Because people like that will tend to internalize their emotions and they will just put them away and put them away and put them away. But as you know, after a while, like the container is going to burst in some way. So self-awareness and self-regulation is what allows us to enter into conflict and be verbally communicative in an effective way, in a relational way. And when we're not, because all of us will lose it at some point, we're able to take accountability. This kind of stuff that you're reading me offers no expectation of accountability. It offers no expectation of accountability for the female partner to have any kind of theory of mind, to have any kind of understanding of what's going on for him, and full permission to be as reactive as she wants or needs to be. And it gives no accountability for the man to communicate, to express himself, to be a partner, to be a vulnerable and emotional partner.
Then let me read the next myth because it relates directly to that. A husband must show unconditional respect, honor, and kindness towards his wife, regardless of how she behaves. Her happiness is the key to a peaceful marriage. Men are encouraged to focus on giving, understanding, and fulfilling their wife's emotional needs without expecting anything in return. Now, not expecting anything in return on some level sounds like a very positive thing. I'm going to do this because I love you, and I'm not doing it because it's conditioned on something. Because I'll say in Pirkei Avot, any love that's conditioned on something will not last forever. And a love which is unconditional will last forever. This sounds on some level like unconditional respect or love, or use your term. What do you think of that?
Look, I think that this gives no respect to men or to women. This idea that no matter what your wife does, that's okay because she's not really expected to do any better is not obviously respectful to her, but it's also not respectful at all to him. Like, why would you have to tell a guy? It's almost like your default for these young men is that they are going to be entitled, abusive, they have no common sense, and you have to come and tell them, no, 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 everything that they want, you give them. So, for example, somebody might be listening to us and they might say, no, 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 these guys have to learn this because they go to yeshiva and they have their meals cooked for them and they have their laundry done for them. And then all of a sudden they get married and they have to learn that they can't treat their wives kind of like they treat the help or their mother or hopefully they don't treat their mothers that way, but they have to be less entitled. So we have to teach them. Well, first of all, it's a little late. Hopefully they have been learning.
But many of them haven't. And now's the time. If not now, then
Yeah,
when?
yeah, all along. A good example would be a young couple with maybe like one or two little kids, and he's leaving every afternoon to go to Mincha and staying for Mariv, and it's like the witching hour. And so she says to him, can you not leave today? The kids are crazy and I need you to stay home. And so his Rebbe might say to him, of course, if your wife wants you not to go to shul, then you should stay home. I think there's actually in the book, The Garden of Peace, here by Rav Shalom Arush, there's an example like this. Even though you know that you need to go to Mincha to connect to Hashem, you need to do what your wife wants you to do, but there isn't any sort of expectation of him that he would have enough common sense and enough midot to on his own say, honey, of course I'm going to help you. Or even better yet, from now on, I'm going to make sure to get a 1 o'clock mincha so that I can also go to mincha, but also be home every day so that I can help you with the bathing and the bedtime and all that. So there's no real expectation of men to have their own authentic sense of values, relational values, and sharing of responsibility. It's basically saying, just do what your wife wants, but it's a management strategy. Just like the surrendered wife is a management strategy, this is a management strategy. And management strategies are not relational.
But even what you just said, Talli, indicates, and I know this is the standard terminology people use, but I will go to an early mincha so I can help you with the bathing. Well, why is he helping her with the bathing? Why aren't they co-nurturing? That's the term we use, but I will go to an early mincha so that you and I can bathe the kids together, or you and I can split the responsibilities.
Have women saying that their husbands are babysitting. They go out and their husbands are babysitting. I'm like, what are you talking about? They're his kids too.
I remember a Doonesbury cartoon from years ago where the husband comes in when the wife is giving a bath. And he says, can I help? She goes, no, you may not help. Help implies it's my responsibility. Try again. Exactly. So he goes out and comes back and he goes, hi, can I co-nurture? She says, no, you get the floor wet. But I think that's the point. I think there is something really there that's genuine. But I want to defend this a little bit, though, because you read this perhaps correctly as the husband is responsible for everything. The wife is assumed to be responsible for nothing. But what if we say that both partners are told, you each must give 100%? Don't do it with an expectation of getting anything in return. But of course, it's based on the assumption that both partners are doing the same thing. They both are looking out entirely for the other one's happiness. Is that necessarily so bad? Because in the case you describe, which again might be what this refers to in this myth, it's saying it's all on the husband. But what if both partners are told, give 100% and you'll both get back 100%?
First of all, I think that they are. In other words, we're talking now just about what the men are told, but we've also talked in the past about what women are told. And I think that obviously, we want to teach young people to be very much aware of their partners and to be very much attuned to their partners, to be curious about what their partners would want and to want to please one another in a sense. But we also want to do that without the loss of our own sense of self. And we need to be able to hold both. That's differentiation. This is what I would want, but I'm hearing that this is what you would want. Let's see if we can kind of resolve this. Now, this approach doesn't give either men or women the benefit, even the expectation that they can do this, right? Women are not capable of controlling their impulses. They're driven fundamentally by primitive feelings, primitive emotions. Men are strong, they're logical, they don't really even understand the world of emotions, so they just have to say, yes, honey, whatever you want, honey, so that women's childish emotional needs will feel gratified. And it really does nothing to help develop the relationship in a mature way where each partner is able to both express what they want, what they like, what they would appreciate, and at the same time recognize that there's another person who they are living with who they also want to be satisfied and happy.
Let me move on to the next myth taught in yeshivot. Again, I use the term myth in general, could be they're true. Marriage is a spiritual journey. The relationship between husband and wife is meant to refine the soul, deepen one's connection to God, and fulfill one's purpose in life. The husband is seen as having a significant responsibility to nurture peace, love, and holiness in the home. He is the spiritual guide and protector of the home. This includes leading by example through prayer, learning Torah, and proper ethics. This leadership is framed not as control, but as service to the family and to help support and uplift the entire family spiritually.
That's interesting. I mean, I think that approach goes along with what the message might. I would be interested in the parallel message here to the woman. Look, I think that both partners ideally want to raise a family in a spiritual way. I mean, the spiritual component of a home is certainly a very strong value and a very strong message. I'm not really sure I understand why it would be only the husband's responsibility to do so. It's a very curious message to me, but it kind of goes along with some of the other. What book is that from?
That is a paraphrase from The Garden of Peace by Rabbi Shalom Arush, who is a student of Eliezer Berland, who has been convicted of all sorts of bad stuff. And he has not left him. Rabbi Arush has remained a supporter of Berland.
We needn't say more.
That says what it says, because people use this book, The Garden of Peace. You see it all over the place, and people seem not to have a problem with that. Let that sit for a second. I think there's also a parallel message that men are often taught, at least I've seen this many times, that women are more spiritual than men. And it's their responsibility to create the spiritual atmosphere of the home. That's something which is also taught, sort of the parallel or maybe mirror image message that women are naturally more spiritual. This goes together with the common explanation about why women are not as obligated in so many mitzvot as men. They don't need them because they already have a more natural closeness to God. And this is actually based on real sources, which say that only women can create inside their own body, which is the most godlike activity a human being can do. And therefore, since God is ultimately the creator, that's the ultimate way we relate to God. So women are naturally closer to God. This is a common message, and therefore they create the spiritual reality in the home. This message is often said in yeshivot that whatever level of religiosity your wife is, that's probably going to be the level of religiosity in your home. Not your religiosity, but your wife. That's going to set the tone for the home that you build.
I think we need to recognize that there's a nuanced, maybe even not so nuanced difference between the messages that we're talking about from the yeshivot, from the more, Litvish yeshivot, which give a message of midot and musar, and they're based on, Michtav Me'Eliyahu, Rabbi Dessler, and other kinds of messages of really, really refining your midot.
That means character traits.
Character traits. That vitur, that being mevater, is based on the refinement of character, as is part of the Musar philosophy. Whereas Rav Arush is Breslov, and it's based on more Kabbalistic principles of woman as receiver and men as influencer, and those sort of roles, I think, more jive with that type of thinking. But the overall message is actually very similar at the end.
Yeah, but the way that it's said and the motivation behind it can actually change the message itself. In other words, if the reason that a man is doing something is because he's trying to fix himself versus trying to fix his wife, it might be the same message, but it can have very different manifestations.
Right. What you read from Rav Arush, I don't think you would hear in Lakewood in the yeshivas there, or in Tells. You wouldn't hear that it's up to the man to provide the spirituality. The women are educated in that system. And I know I went to that kind of high school and I was educated in that way. The women are educated that they are just as responsible for the spiritual upbringing of the home as the man. I think that it's a very different approach to the Garden of Peace. I cannot relate to it at all. It really presses a lot of buttons. It doesn't really expect a lot of women, and it doesn't expect a lot of women spiritually either.
Let me move on to the next one. Do not criticize, lecture, or attempt to control your wife, which is both harmful and disrespectful. accept her for who she is.
That's not a bad message. And it has to be taken into the context of everything else. That's not the end of the sentence. And I'll tell you why. Obviously, if you're having an argument or if you're having a conflict and you're trying to change who she is, that's never going to work. You can't change another person and you can only kind of radically embrace who they are, but you also have choices. That does not mean that you should suffer emotional or certainly physical, which is less common with the gender divide, physical strength. But women can be emotionally abusive. Nobody should suffer abuse in their marriage. And so if you take it too far and you also get the message that you don't get to talk about your own feelings or you just have to kind of take it, then that already can be harmful. So we have to take things into perspective. But yes, we want to learn not to blame, because blaming, shaming, attacking, criticizing, those are not going to necessarily get you anywhere. And also, in most cases, it's really not about being right or wrong. In most cases, it's really about recognizing that in marriage, there's going to be harmony, there's going to be disharmony, there's going to be repair, and then you can get back to harmony. So really, what creates the spirituality in the home, what creates Shalom Bayit really is kind of how marriage, again, mirrors the relationship between God and man. And not in the sense that God is the man and the people of Israel is the woman, but in the sense that in relationships, we have ruptures. And we have a way when we are disconnected from God to repair the rupture. And that when we interact with one another with respect and with compassion and with love and with fidelity, trust, then we are creating something that's a very beautiful marriage. But the kind of patriarchal, patronizing approach that's being touted in these philosophies are not mirroring the relationship between God and man. God has very, very specific expectations from the people of Israel. It's a two-way street.
I have two things to say about that. The first one is, in terms of this idea, accept her for what or whom she is. Of course, that's true, but it can turn into a problem if that means you can never, ever tell her that something bothers you, because whatever she does, I have to accept. That's when we have a problem. There's a difference between accepting the person for who that person is versus whatever that person does to me, I'm simply going to take it and I don't care. As you said, a type of emotional abuse. That's where that divide really is. Accepting the person for herself, but also understanding that that doesn't mean that you could be abused. You have to stand up for yourself.
Absolutely.
And the second idea I'm thinking of right now when you're talking about repairing a rupture, in Kiddush Levana, the blessing over the sanctification of the new moon we make every month, there's lots of interesting symbolism there. But essentially, part of this idea is that in a certain sense, we talk about the sun represents God and the moon represents Israel. And every month, the moon grows in terms of how much the sun shines on it. And then the second half of the month, it wanes, it goes down. That's why we always say Kiddush Levana on the first half of the month, when our relationship is growing. To me, what's interesting about that is that rupture doesn't only happen because someone did something wrong. It's part of the natural cycle of the universe. Galut, the idea of exile, is not simply a punishment. It's also built into things. Relationships wax and wane. They come and go. That doesn't mean that you give up. That's not what I mean at all. But there can be moments when a couple feel more distant from each other, not because someone did something wrong, but just because that's the way life goes. You have to still repair it, but it doesn't mean that someone did something necessarily wrong. That's certainly true in our relationship with God. Sometimes that's the way nature was designed. And I assume you would agree with me, maybe you can tell me otherwise, that that's also true in marriages.
I love it. I love what you're saying. I think that's a very, very beautiful framing. It also really normalizes the ebbs and flows of marriage. And I think that that's also what contributes to the stability of it in a way, the knowledge that we can have times of disconnection and then we can reconnect and repair. And the closeness and I would say a little bit of the separation and then the kind of coming back, that kind of also brings in the whole monthly cycle and the separating during the needed time and then coming back together. But even if we don't look at that, which is pretty built in, even if we just look at the relationship itself and its own variables that will contribute to closeness and kind of moving apart and coming together, these are normal.
It doesn't mean someone's always to blame. It's part of nature.
Yeah. I think that the overall message that we don't want to create a blaming environment is a good message. But what these approaches lack are skills for interacting in a relational way with each other. It's kind of promoting an approach that says, I have to work on myself independently. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with working on yourself. There are many, many things that people can do in their marriages to take accountability for their part and work on it. Certainly, women who are overly reactive and men who are overly reactive should work on self-regulation skills so that they don't show up in the marriage without being able to kind of control their impulses. But you can't do it all alone. I mean, it's a relationship. That's the whole point. So to say that all the work is your own work is to discount the idea of how we affect one another. I believe in the differentiation. I bring that up all the time. But at the end of the day, we live together. We affect one another.
Okay. Speaking of regulation, here's another one. Be patient and don't act impulsively during anger or during conflict. A husband should focus on the long-term health of his relationship with his wife rather than the desire to win the argument right now. Challenges in marriage are opportunities for growth rather than obstacles.
There's nothing in that I do not agree with, but I believe that it is true for both partners. Why would that very good advice only be for the man? I think that both partners need to be able to show up in their wise minds, and if they don't, to take accountability and to kind of work on that. Again, this idea that that's the man's job, but the woman who is so emotionally labile can't be expected to do that, is really kind of like the ongoing mansplaining that starts with, oh, you must be getting your period, or that kind of thing. Now, look, there are times in a woman's life cycle that she is particularly vulnerable. And obviously, it's very good advice to give to a man to be sensitive to that. But to completely reduce a woman's abilities to her emotional sensitivities only is really, really very devaluing. And by the way, I learned a new Hebrew word the other day, lehazgvir.
Lehazgvir?
Lehazgvir.
What does that mean?
What do you think?
To mansplain?
Lehazgvir.
Yes. To mansplain. Okay.
Lehazgvir. I heard it on a podcast in Hebrew.
I will say, based on what you're saying right now, one thing I've noticed in some of these books, certainly not all, but some books are said, this is a book for the man. Some books don't say they're for men, but they implicitly say, this is a book for marriage. So always treat your wife well, or whatever.
Not a bad message. Always treat your wife well. We should treat each other well.
For sure. But it says, this is a book for the husband and the wife. So always treat your wife well. It doesn't realize sometimes it's speaking to the husband. It's always speaking in sort of gendered language in that way.
Okay, well, that's kind of all the texts.
Okay, Talli, how about one more myth? The husband should always say thank you to his wife for everything she does, big and small. Gratitude is a key to fostering love and minimizing conflict.
Look, I happen to think that gratitude is a very, very important resource in marriage. And I think that both partners should appreciate one another and express appreciation to one another. And one partner doesn't have any more obligation to do so than the other. And I don't think anybody has an obligation to do so. I don't think it should come out of obligation. I think that the idea is that we want to cultivate relationships whereby the feelings that are expressed, whether they're gratitude or anything else, are authentic. We don't want to cultivate people to kind of act out their marriage, but rather to be real with each other. That's what intimacy really is. And when everybody's kind of busy with following certain rules that will create or administrate how their partner is going to respond, then we're not really in an intimate relationship.
Yeah, but on the other hand, there's a concept in Chazal of mitoch shelo lishma balishma, doing something good, perhaps for the wrong reason, still do it because eventually you'll start doing it for the right reason. So I would say, perhaps, even if someone doesn't understand the concept of gratitude, let's say they just weren't brought up with that idea, but they train themselves to always thank their wives, that's still a good thing. That's not as good as doing it naturally. And the hope would be that eventually they would come to that point where they would actually feel that gratitude innately because they're used to saying thank you and realizing that gratitude is a good thing if they internalize that message. Would you not agree that it's better to say thank you and not mean it than to not say anything at all?
And when you say mitoch shelo lishma balishma, what you were saying is you do it anyway, even if you don't mean it, is how you put it. right?
I don't mean that you feel ingratitude, but you don't deeply feel gratitude. Say thank you anyway if she does something which benefits you. For example, let's say the husband has a sort of 1950s attitude that it's the wife's job to cook dinner, so when the husband comes home, dinner is ready. That's the kind of household he grew up in, and therefore he has no sense of gratitude. That's just your job. That's just the expectation. For the moment, let's ignore his benighted expectations. Let's also ignore the fact that just because someone does their job, that doesn't mean you shouldn't feel gratified that they did it. The fact is, this guy says it's her job and I don't feel gratitude. Still, of course, say thank you. Even if you're not really feeling gratitude, you should feel gratitude. So at least by expressing it, perhaps later on you'll come to feel that, you know what, actually I should be grateful for this. She did something for me no matter what. So of course I should feel gratitude. At least start by expressing it. And later on, hopefully you'll come to feel that. That's what I mean.
Yeah, no, totally. I get that. I hear that. I think it is important to, as a matter of fact, in one of the couples therapy interventions in imago therapy, they do a gratitude exercise. You have couples spend 5 minutes every day saying one thing. This is one thing that I really appreciate about you today. I think gratitude is a really, really, really important resource. And I think you're right. I think that even if you aren't naturally inclined to either feel or express gratitude, doing so, I guess you would say behaviorally or mechanically, can possibly eventually create those feelings, especially as the relationship becomes more real and more authentic. So yeah, I think you are right about that.
Okay, Talli. Well, this is very interesting. I think we learned a lot today. I think there's a lot of information here which hopefully people will find useful because, as I said at the beginning, people hear many things when they're growing up. Some of them are true and some of them are very helpful and some of them are mixed messages and some of them are actually damaging. I hope that our conversation today will help our listeners to better pay attention to some of the messages that they received, perhaps unquestioningly, and as well-meaning as the bearers of those messages are, it could be that some of them do not necessarily align with the values that you want to put into your own marriage. And it's important that people simply pay attention and say, what really is this saying? And does this really align with the kind of marriage that I want to create? Okay, everybody, thank you for joining us for this month's Intimate Judaism. Make sure to keep coming back for more episodes as we continue moving forward. Go to intimatejudaism.com, subscribe to the podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.